Have you ever had to put something away, to throw something away? We live in a time when there's an emphasis to some degree within our culture on doing that, right? On cleaning out your closets and your storage and your garage, being minimalistic and focusing on what's essential. There have been some times in history where the opposite was the case, where it was emphasized to hold on to things, or at least that became a part of people's almost personality, where they just, I might need that in 30 years, right? And so you got to hang on to it. Maybe you're like me, and there's some things in your closet. I mean, you should probably go through your closet and clean out your closet, but there's some things that they're getting a little aged. They're starting to get a few of those issues where the fabric is losing losing a lot of things, and it's time to throw it away, or at least give it to Goodwill or something, right? But we tend to sometimes want to hang on to those things for whatever reason, whether there's some actual sentimentality that's attached to it, or it's just that it's in our closet, or it's in wherever. I don't want to have to put it away. There's a passage of Scripture that informs us, not beyond informs us, tells us, we have to, as Christians, we have to put certain things away. We have to throw them out, lay them aside. And it is no small suggestion. It is a very strong idea that we, from the Holy Spirit in Colossians chapter 3, that if we're going to really be the people that belong to the Son of God, we must be changed so completely, so thoroughly, inside and out, that there are certain behaviors, there's a certain way of life that we have to leave behind us. Or, as he puts it, we have to put it all away. Colossians chapter 3, we'll begin this morning at verse 7. The first 6 verses have reached out to us with a message of resurrection, a message of new life, a message of just newness in Jesus. But then, about verse 5, Paul has talked about putting certain things, or he talks about putting certain things to death, put to death. And now, it's the same basic teaching, but he uses a different phrase, and it is put away. I want you to throw it away. There are a few different put aways in these verses. The first one, he says, put away your past. Put away your past. Whether we like to think about it or not, whether it's something that we're very open with, we all have a past, don't we? I don't care if you, as we say, grew up in the church, or you at least grew up in a religious family or background. And sometimes we almost spin it that way, that it's like, if you were that, then there's not really that much that you had to change or had to clean up. You just had to get wet, and that was about it. You know, you get baptized just because you're supposed to, and that's about it. But we all, let's say that again, we all have a past. The real problem is that even after we become a Christian, that past, almost in reverse fashion, it likes to hold on to us. It likes to cling rather closely. Colossians chapter 3, verse 7 is where we are reminded and encouraged to leave it in the past. Colossians 3, verse 7. In the middle of discussing various practices that shouldn't belong to a Christian's life, Paul writes, in these sins and sinful ways, you too once walked. You might pull out that word once with some special umph this morning. That was where we once were. It's about the past. It's where you once were. So there's the past, and the implication now there's now. There's the present. that should be different. He says, we once walked when you were living in them. You were once that way. You once lived that way. Notice that too, that it's about a walk and living in. Now something's meant to change. For a second or two, okay, more than a couple of seconds, but look back, maybe a page to chapter 1. Let's read 3 verses here. By way of reminding us, we didn't just read the letter, but if we were reading this letter, even like those in Colossae for the first time in public when they would receive this letter and read it aloud, here's something just a few moments earlier we would have read if we were reading it straight through, even as we got to what we call chapter 3. Here's chapter 1, 21 through 23. Here he writes, and you who once, there's that word again, were alienated and hostile in mind. This is an internal thinking problem, but then it becomes actions, as our thinking leads to, doing evil deeds. But then he says he has now, this is the theological basis for Colossians 3:7. Here's where you were, but now he has reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless, not alienated and hostile in evil deeds anymore, but the opposite, above reproach before him. And then he does add, which really points us now to Colossians 3, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all the creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. The letter to the Colossians, in Colossians 3:7, now even in chapter 1, is a message of leaving, putting away where we once were. Those habits, those behaviors, things that even started in here in our mind. We had this stance against truth, a rebellion against God, where we walked and lived in the grain of our culture. Now we're learning to cut across the grain, to live in a way that is transformed in Jesus. And it starts by putting our past behind us. In a different letter that the same human author wrote, and the same divine author for sure, we find a very similar reminder to the Christians in ancient Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Mainly verse 11 is where he says that, but 9 and 10 give you some of the things he's describing to them. Such were some of you. We could say that today, that we were a certain way. We are to put away our past. But let's keep reading. That's the beginning point, is Paul's reminding us where we were, and now he gets to this actual practices, certain practices that he lists for us, certain behaviors that we are to put away. As you read these, 8 and 9 of Colossians 3, no, they don't talk about sex. But if you look at this paragraph, we started midway in the paragraph. We looked at 5 and 6 a couple of weeks ago. If you were here, and if you weren't, that's okay too. But out of all the sins that Paul could talk about in this section, the 2 categories of sin that he does emphasize are those that are sexual in nature, are those that are about our words or our speech. In verse 5, most, if not all, of the words listed are of a sexual nature. Here, although a couple, like the first 2, anger and wrath, they're not necessarily limited to our words. We sometimes do things and actions out of our anger, but they tend to be focused there. And the overall emphasis here in verses 8 and 9 are on what we say. And so I thought about how those 2 are connected. I thought about the way that they both are great potentials or have great potential for good. How that both of these are wonderful, powerful, beautiful gifts that God has given us. How both are essential for human life to continue in a different sense, but they both are. But they both have that other potential. How much damage, how much power in the way of temptation, of how easy it is to fall into it, but then also of what it does. And now we're kind of getting into the third one a bit. There's some overlap. But they're both powerful gifts. And partly because of that, they're both not meant to be treated casually. Not meant to be treated as just something that you can do. But it's also rather ironic that in our society, these are two of the things that many have no concept, it seems, of boundaries or restrictions or self-control. If I had to say in my experience, it's, if anything, speech is even less that way. For instance, there are some people that they would never, or at least they would never even condone it, at least positively, having an affair, committing adultery. But it's nothing for every other sentence to include profanity coming from their lips. And it's just like, who would even think that that might be an issue? There's no filter, and it's just this casual thing. Yet God tells us to be careful even of our idle words. And then you think about how these two have such an impact. We may not think so much about the one. We get how sexual sins destroy a family, a marriage, a whole family, if there are more than just two people involved, and there always are in some way. How it perverts and destroys whole civilizations, and has, and may be helping to destroy our current one. We get that. But do we really get the immense effect and damage that our words can have? Think about it this way. Do we treat these two differently? I think we do. And I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't. I'm asking the question, do we? And if we do, why do we? Why do we look at them differently? Like if you do something of if it's sexual immorality, man, that's a big deal. But if you have a tongue that is mean-spirited, or if you're a gossip, or if, well, that's just who you are. We might sweep that one under the rug. In the church. I'm not talking about society any longer. Why does Paul focus in on those two in this chapter? Let's take a closer look at some of those in verse 8 and 9. Let's read the two verses together now in Colossians chapter 3. He says, but now, you once, but now you must put them all away. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. And then verse 9, the first part of verse 9, do not lie to one another. The first two, anger and wrath, they're pretty synonymous. Anger, the word that's translated anger, is a more broad or general term. It's actually the same word that is translated wrath back in verse 6. And I don't say that to get super deep into the languages, but as a simple way of pointing out, these terms are very interchangeable. Even in English, sometimes we translate them anger, sometimes it's wrath. Back to back here, you get two different words. Anger, this emotion that burns within us. This disposition where we say things that later we'll say we didn't mean. We'll say something bitter and hateful in the moment of anger. And then later, in a calmer state of mind, as we might be apologizing, or at least we'll say something along the lines of, well, you know I didn't mean that, right? Or did I? And what that says is either, verse 9, the last one, either I was lying in my anger, or I really did mean it. Maybe it took anger to allow it to come out. I might have thought it, if not for and just thought it alone, if not for anger to propel it and verbalize it. The word that he uses for wrath, it is a bit stronger. This is one where I'm more likely to say and or do something in my anger to get back at someone. It's more of a vengeful anger where you've said something to me that insulted my honor, or you've done something that was you shouldn't have done that. And it just tears me up. And I've got to give you a piece of my mind, or maybe even do something to settle the score. And that's when anger is explosive. The word wrath here can be explosive anger. Have you ever seen somebody just explode, or have I ever done that? Have I ever just went off the handle? We have these little phrases we create, and sometimes they're very expressive. Sometimes they might be trying to curtail, and you put a cute little label on it and it doesn't sound so bad. But this can also be where anger and wrath turn slowly into more of a grudging bitterness. If unchecked, it goes there. I think about Jesus. Jesus got angry. When Paul mentions anger and wrath here, this is not any kind of anger, but Jesus got angry. But when? If there was a moment in Jesus' life when we could look and say, that'd be when I'd get angry, what would it be? Would it be when, if you put yourself in Jesus' sandals, would it be when someone slaps you? Or even pummels you in the face? Covers you in their saliva? Would it be when they lay you down on a piece of wood to nail you to a cross? We get angry when we get insulted. Jesus got angry when people had hard hearts toward the truth, and when people, to use that same word, when people insulted God. Now, I firmly believe, and you know that Jesus is divine, but within the earthly context, it's not how he operated. The next two words follow along, unfortunately, very well from anger and wrath. Malice. It's one of those words we have in English where the word has this sound, even phonetically to it, that gives you some idea maybe of what's coming in definition. Malice. I mean, if you really stress the syllables, it's even better, right? This is when I enjoy seeing you suffer. That's what malice is. Now, whether it's when someone has to inflict that on the other person themselves, or it's just when somebody else hurts you, or something bad happens to you in life, I get to smile. Because you're my enemy, or because of some conflict or something, or just some people tend to find some kind of pleasure, awkwardly enough, in other people's pain. Something Satan gets us tricked into doing, feeling. And then slander comes out of that, because then I got to talk about you. Then I got to run and call somebody up and say, hey, did you know? Did you hear? Oh, let me tell you what they did. Can you believe they said that to me? It's also the same word we translate blasphemy when we talk about God being slandered or insulted. And so here it's more humanity talking about humanity behind their back. And it's so helpful, isn't it? The way that a reputation can be destroyed in minutes with one person talking to one other person. Then Paul says, obscene talk. This is where I have no filter. If it's a dirty joke, if it's something that is inappropriate, it might be something that could be appropriate between a husband and wife in private. But I get with the boys or I get with the girls. Both do it. It's a different story. And it's almost like the anger part where we didn't mean it. The justification is, it's just a joke. It's just fun. I mean, you can't call it good fun, but it's just fun. This one also could bring with it abusive speech, where we're abrasive to somebody else, or we use even profanity, or we use something that's filthy to attack somebody else. And so we call them a name, or we beat up another person with our words. Might be our spouse, it might be, who knows? And then that last one that he lists, at least here, isn't that one so simple? He writes it that way. He just says, don't do this. Don't lie. How much simpler can you get than don't lie? And here in this context, he's not saying you can lie to other people, but here it's, don't lie to your brothers and sisters. I mean, if you're going to lie to somebody, wouldn't that be the worst? Be people of truth. There's an old proverb, old Jewish proverb, that we need to teach our tongues that when we don't know the answer, to just not answer. But then we're on the spot. And so instead we like to make something up. Or someone is talking about something and we don't know anything about it, but they say, you know about this, right? And we'll just, yeah, of course. I know about that. I heard about that event in history, or I know about this recent event in news. I mean, who wants to feel left out like that? Or we lie to cover our tracks. Might be something sinful we've done or just something we've forgotten about. Oh, well, nobody told me about that. When it's been on your calendar for weeks, you just forgot or you didn't want to go. Or I'm sorry, something came up. Or did it? But that's what Paul says. Just don't lie. So he starts with anger, and then he ends with lie. And in the middle, you get all these others that sometimes are connected. I say that because sometimes it might be that only one of these is our real struggle. Some of us might struggle with them all, 1, 2. Maybe there's just that one who gets us. But in this teaching, it is bigger than just a list of shall nots. Do we ever make Christianity that? It's just another religion out there that tells you here, don't do these things and do these things. And sometimes the people that focus on the do things, they make fun of the people that focus on the shall nots and vice versa, but they're both in the same boat, really. Just the opposites. Because it has put away your past. And what does that look like? Well, here's some examples. But it's put it away because you've already put off the old person, the old self. Now, you've already put on the new self. Read the rest of verse 9 with me as we think about being putting away because, well, I left off those other words there, all right? So if you want to fill out the handout, it's going to be kind, pure, and honest. If you did focus it on the positive side of our words. All that Paul mentions there would be in those three categories. But let's finish verse 9 now and read through the end of the paragraph through verse 11. He says, "Do not lie to one another, seeing or because you have put off the old self with its practices," some of those we just listed with Paul, "and have put on the new self." And I know if you just looked at the slide, it almost could sound like put away your new self, but there's a few extra words in between there. Put away because of your new self. And then he describes that further this way, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. Here, verse 11, there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. This is an ongoing renewal where we are being, Paul says, renewed. Or how else do we say that? We're being made new on a daily, even more than daily, it might be moment by moment basis. There are several passages that describe this process. That tells me this is a big deal. If I'm a Christian, this is something that should be right up there for me. Really, something I need to spend time thinking about, spend time reading, and then living that way. Living like I'm being new every day. It is a process. It's not going to happen overnight. It is not that I'm baptized, old self's gone, put on the new self. That's what Paul says, right? And then I get to walk out the doors of the church building or come up from the creek bank and I'm brand new and totally everything I need to be for Jesus. No, that's just the beginning point of being renewed. It's ongoing. It's growth. Now we'll use this to excuse our lack of growth. And we'll say things like, I'm still growing. It's a process. Well, we're not even growing at all. Have you reached that point yet in your life with Jesus where you've grown complacent about growth? Instead of growing closer to Jesus, you've grown to where you're kind of stopped. You're kind of stuck. This passage is written to you today to say, wake up. Look at Jesus. Know who you are in Jesus. Be renewed. But this renewal is image-based. It's icon-based. It's based in His image. It is not, here's your list of things to do, and here's your list of things not to do. It is these practices were a part of your old life. Now you're in Jesus. Now God has called you out of the world to be shaped and conformed to the image of His dear Son. If you wanted to put another verse out on about beside that one, it'd be Romans chapter 8, 29 and 30. Conformed to the image of Jesus. His perfect image. That doesn't mean I'm going to be perfect in this life, but it does mean that I have the one to look to. I have the one to give me the power and the strength to not just live a different life, but to truly be transformed. And then, at first, out of the blue, Paul starts talking about division and differences. Cultural, social, ethnic. Isn't that the last verse there? He says these barriers are broken down here. What's the here? here in Jesus, here where this process of renewal is happening, where Jesus has created and is still creating a new humanity, that while that's happening, and because we're all in Jesus and Jesus is in all of us, we're all clothed with Jesus, that we are to start learning to see through these barriers that he has already broken down, that we still like to put up and hold to. Some of these he mentions here easily carry over to our time. One that he doesn't mention specifically here that has become an issue in our time is an age difference. We have made a science and an identity out of generations. Have you caught that? That's what everybody's talking about. What generation are you in? And how do you relate? And how are you different from the other generation? And the generations can't get along. And if you don't think it's if you think it's not happening in the church, think again. And I get there's some value in thinking about how things, culture and environment shapes us. But we must be careful that our identity in Jesus isn't lost in our age, the color of our skin, any of those things that we make classes out of. That's what verse 11 is about class warfare. Paul says if we're in Jesus, this new self means those barriers and those things in one way are a part of that past. They're still a part of who you are, but they're not the new self that you are in Jesus. In Colossians chapter 3, 7 through 11, the Holy Spirit says, put it away. Put away your past. What does that look like, Spirit? Looks like when you get angry selfishly and you say things you either do or you shouldn't say, you do or you don't mean. It looks like when someone in your life is so far on that side of your list where you think thoughts and you encourage thoughts that are malicious or just plain evil about them. What does it look like? It looks like not holding on to that, but holding on to who you really are in Jesus. When he uses that word image, it takes us back to the first Adam. A-D-A-M, not A-T-O-M. He was created in the image of his Creator, just like Paul says here. But then it also brings you forward to the second Adam, Jesus. And what happens when we become Christians, what happens when we live like Christians, is that we get to finally be who we were created to be. All because of Jesus. All because we have come to him. If you need to do that for the first time or for the first time in a long time, won't you come as we stand and sing this song together?